the wild man is an anthropomorphic being in the popular beliefs of the Germanic and Slavic linguistic area from the early Middle Ages to the beginning of modern times. He was described or portrayed as a loner, endowed with giant powers, strongly hairy, naked, or only with moss or foliage-clothed primitive man. His way of life was considered on the one hand semi-animal and primitive, but on the other hand also paradisaical and close to nature. Uninhabited or uninhabitable forest and mountain areas were considered his preferred residence. A common Middle English term for the wild man was woodwose or wodwose, also spelled woodehouse, woodwas. Wodwose occurs in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight around the year 1390. The Middle English word is first attested for the 1340s in references to the wild man decorative artwork popular at the time in a Latin description of an embroidery of the great wardrobe of Edward III. Still, as a surname, it is found as early as 1251 of one Robert de Woodwose. About an actual legendary or mythological creature, the term is found during the 1380s in Wycliffe's Bible, translating Sheol, Elex Daemonia, Latin Pelosi meaning hairy in Isaiah 13:21. The occurrences in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight date to soon after Wycliffe's Bible, around 1390. Etymology of woodwose. The first element of woodwose is usually explained as from wudu, meaning wood or forest, derived from the Proto-Germanic wudus, which means woodland, wood, or tree. The second element is less clear. It has been identified as a hypothetical noun, wasa meaning being, from the verb wesan, wosan, which means to be or to be alive. The Old English form is unattested, but it would have been wudewasa. It may also mean a forlorn or abandoned person, cognate with the German Weiss and Dutch Wies, which both mean orphan. Old High German had the terms schrat, scrato, or scrasso, which appear in glosses of Latin works as translations for fauni, sylvestris, or pelosi, identifying the creatures as hairy woodland beings. Some of the local names suggest associations with characters from ancient mythology. Common in Lombardy and the Italian-speaking parts of the Alps are the terms salvan and salvang, which derive from the Latin Silvanus, the name of the Roman tutelary god of gardens and the countryside. Similarly, folklore in Tyrol and German-speaking Switzerland into the 20th century included a wild woman known as Fange or Fanke, derived from the Latin fauna, the feminine form of faun. Medieval German sources give as names for the wild woman Lamia and Holzmoya. The former clearly refers to the Greek wilderness demon Lamia, while the latter derives ultimately from Maya, a Greco-Roman earth and fertility goddess who is identified elsewhere with fauna and who exerted a wide influence on medieval wild man lore. Slavic has leshi, meaning forest man. Other wild men in Europe. Various languages and traditions include names suggesting affinities with Orcus, a Roman and Italic god of death. For many years, people in Tyrol called the wild man Orce, Lorc, or Noerglain, while in parts of Italy, he was the Orco or Huorco. The French ogre has the same derivation, as do modern literary orcs. Importantly, Orcus is associated with Maya in a dance celebrated late enough to be condemned in a 9th or 10th century Spanish penitential. The Basques had their Basahon, an important figure in Basque mythology. Wild men are a specifically Central European form of a mythical idea of semi-human forest dwellers that occurs worldwide in all cultures. These creatures first appear as wild people, medieval Latin Silvani or wild people, later personified as wild man and wild woman, or also as wild lady. The various views of forest men and wild men, which have grown out of customs and literature, have condensed in the visual arts into the representation of a wild, hairy, often loin-clothed human being. These beings, who in the literal translation illustrate the wild, include all versions of these mythical figures. This characterization persists through all stylistic epochs. In the texts and representations, the wild man often has a metaphorical meaning. He stands for the wild, the threatening nature, for the overcoming of nature, for outdated cultural development stages of man, and for certain characteristics of men which are perceived as primeval. In the Middle Ages, the wild man was transformed from a myth of popular belief, an archetype of chaos, to a symbol of desirable character traits in the stories of the upper class. Appearances of wild men. Wild men, and more rarely wild women, appear in legends, fairy tales, and medieval literature since the middle of the 14th century in emblematic representations of medieval art on tapestries, miniature boxes, choir stalls, reliquary boxes, tiles, glass paintings, graphics, as a sign in card games, as a common figure, or more often as a shield holder in coats of arms, as coin pictures, as a house sign, and as a man figure in half-timbered houses, as a figure in processions, festivals and rituals, depicted by a disguised human being, as eponym for parcels and mountains, for mining facilities, such as mines and galleries, for mining towns, and later also for gastronomic facilities such as hotels and restaurants, as a metaphor for certain characteristics of man, and especially in the international literature of the 1980s, as a metaphor for aspects of the gender role of men in redefining the distribution of gender roles in the course of social upheaval. Features and benefits. Especially in the archaic legends of the Alps, mainly Tyrol, do wild men have certain characteristics of ghosts and nature demons. Bossayoun and the offspring of Sylvanus are also nature demons. In most cases, however, wild men are human beings and not transcendent beings. That is, they are not beings from another world, for example, the divine world, who materialize arbitrarily in this world and appear in different forms and can disappear again. Since wild men are not able to do this, they can also be captured by man. Wild men have superhuman abilities, sometimes something like magic powers or visionary abilities, but they are even biological beings that are vulnerable, can be shot at and hurt. They can have a sexual and family life. Wild men are human. Wild men are also human beings, not animal beings. Apart from their intensive hair growth or hypertrichosis, their great physical strength and nakedness, which can also occur in normal people, they have no animal characteristics. They have no hooves, no tail, and no horns. In representations and narratives, the wild man is always barefoot and, unlike animals, armed with a club or a torn tree. Wild men are usually inferior to humans when their great physical strength is rendered harmless. This can happen through sexual seduction, but also through female virtue, through alcohol, through magic, through combat with professional military training and armament, through long-range weapons, or through other particularly intelligent measures. They can then be locked up and kept in cages like animals, prisoners, or lunatics. The expectations of getting to the bottom of the mystery of their savagery, however, are fundamentally disappointing. Only at the beginning of modern times did the wild men become guardians of mostly metal treasures, a role that had previously been ascribed to the magical and technologically superior dwarfs. This was the time when humans had to systematically open up the last uninhabited areas of the Middle Ages in order to access the mineral resources that were waiting to be discovered in the mountains, which had previously been avoided as inhospitable and wild. Here, they encountered the savagery of nature, from which they were able to take away its treasures by previously unknown methods. Typically, it is here for the first time that miners encounter the wild man, something which had been the privilege of hunters for centuries. The wild man and the Neanderthal memory. It is no longer possible to reconstruct whether the ideas of the wild man spread all over the world have preserved old memories of the times when several species of hominini still existed side by side. Although modern humans, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, have lived in the immediate vicinity of Central Europe for about 10,000 years and, at least in a certain time window before the splitting up in the Eurasian populations, also produced common offspring, which can be proven in the genetic material of the Eurasian populations living today. However, due to the large time gap between the extinction of the last Neanderthals 30,000 to 25,000 years ago and the first written figure of a wild man in the Gilgamesh epic more than 20,000 years later, no verifiable connection can be established. This is all the more true for the distribution of the wild man theme in early medieval to modern Europe. The wild man in the Bible and Christianity. Some references in the Old Testament speak in favor of the explanation that the stories of the wild man are based on the transitional period from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, when people developed from hunters and gatherers to farmers and cattle breeders. The old biblical stories have a certain significance here, as they come from the area where agriculture was first developed. Genesis 2:5-33 deals with the dispute between the twin brothers Esau, the older, instinctive, hairy hunter, and Jacob, the younger, self-conscious, fine-skinned, urban, intellectual, cultivated, favorite son of Mother Rebecca. The competition between agriculture and hunting shows the superiority of the new form of society. The hunter Esau must sell his right of inheritance to his brother Jacob, who is agriculturally active and thus economically superior, in order to have anything to eat at all. Jacob, the chosen one of God, thus became the progenitor of the 12 tribes of Israel. The hairy Esau went away empty-handed and became the progenitor of a mountain people. In the ancient legends of the Alpine region, wild men depicted, among other things, nature, which was difficult to tame and unpredictable, and which made it particularly difficult for people in inhospitable regions to cope with industrialization. Man felt defenseless to the forces and personified them in a series of mythical figures, including the wild men, for example in Wild on Styria. In Christianity, wild men stand outside creation and the plan of salvation. They are figures of the lower mythology, which serve in the ecclesiastical understanding to symbolize the virtuous victory over them, and thus over the wild, the lower, and the vicious. In the imagination of medieval man, anything wild was considered to be that which stood outside human culture, community, custom, and norm. Moreover, it was considered the desert and the undeveloped, the confused and the disastrous. For this reason, the wild men often appear in the late Middle Ages on Fastnacht or Shrove Tuesday, when, together with the other fools, they represent the representatives of the distance from God and thus of the devil. As these representatives, the wild man and the wild woman can be seen together with the fool and the devil on a vaulted console of the Holy Cross Minster in Rottweil. The courtly literature of the Middle Ages contrasted the knights, who were regarded as social role models, with various fright figures to show their ethical and militant superiority. These figures included not only dragons and giants but also wild men. At the beginning of the early modern era, the aspect emerged that the overcoming of nature, here in the form of the wild man, also opened up opportunities for wealth for mankind. The opening up of inhospitable regions by the courageous advance of the miners was linked with legends of the overcoming of wild men who guarded metal mineral resources. This led to the use of the wild man motif on coins and coats of arms. They thus became a symbol of the wealth gained from nature and are still proudly presented today. Similar phenomena. Forest and mountain spirits. Forest and mountain spirits in the broadest sense appear in legends and fairy tales throughout Europe and beyond. These creatures are depicted as much more powerful than the wild man. They are regarded as masters of nature and can be influenced by man, but not destroyed. The Schrott seems to be similar to the wild man in many respects. In the Riesengebirge, or giant mountains, the Rubezahl is at home. In Scandinavia, the Skogsfru haunts the mountains. These are ghostly creatures that can appear in various forms. They are able to transform and simply disappear. They usually have magical powers or the power of nature. Rubezahl is considered the lord of the mountains. He can cause thunderstorms to which man is then helplessly exposed. Although there are stories in which he is tricked by man, one cannot catch and imprison Rubezahl. The insane or outcast. In old stories, for example in the Bible or in medieval poetry, there are reports of people who, due to an accident or a punishment from God, have fallen into madness and have to live wild like an animal without reason. This may include tearing off their clothes and running naked into the wilderness. Outcasts, confused and lost people are depicted similarly to wild men, but in contrast to them, crawling on all fours. Such a punishment is imposed on the figure of Nebuchadnezzar from the report in Daniel chapter 4, verses 1-34. Nebuchadnezzar is an arrogant tyrant who persecutes the Jews. A heavenly voice announces the deepest humiliation to him. he falls into madness and has to live like an animal and eat grass for 7 years. In the Welsh Merlin legend and the Latin Vita Merlini based on it, the poet Myrddin meets such a fate. When his master is killed in a battle, he loses his mind, runs into the woods and speaks there to an apple tree and the pigs. So he lives 50 years until he is healed by a miracle spring. A haunting description can also be found as the central plot turn in the Middle High German Arthurian novel Ewain by Hartmann von Aue. The Arthurian knight, Ewain, misses a deadline set by his wife, and thus loses her favor. Thereupon he flees from the court, becomes a raving addict, and ekes out his life in the woods as an undressed madman. Do wort sin Riue also groß das ihm in das Hirne schoß, ein Zorn und ein Tobesut, brach sine Sight und sine Zut und zarte Abesin gewandt, das ward blotsam ein Hand. Sus lief über gewilde Nacket nach der Wielde. Freely translated. Then his remorse became so great that anger and raving madness shot into his brain. He forgot decency and upbringing, pulled his robe off his body until he was completely exposed, so he ran naked across the sunny fields into the wilderness. Medieval epic. The figure of the wild man appears frequently in the profane literature of the Middle Ages. We find early examples as Schrott, already in Old High German glosses. Since the 11th century, here with Burchard of Worms, for the first time, the wild woman is mentioned. Heinrich von Hessler describes them as people living in forests, waters, caves, and mountains. Chrétien de Troyes, in Le Chevalier au Lion ou Le Roman d'Ivan, around 1170, writes about the knightly title hero who temporarily changes into a wild man and can only be cured by the lady of his heart. In the Arthur novel, Wigelois, a wild woman is described. In other courtly novels, too, the wild people with their rough, unbridled nature form a counterworld to courtly life. In the medieval epics of the hero Dietrich von Bern, it is reported how the hero fights with different mythical figures, giants and dragons. In the story Der Jüngere Siegenot, he also meets a wild man who has captured a dwarf. The dwarf calls Dietrich for help because he fears that the wild man wants to kill him. He calls him Teufel, or devil. Dietrich fights against the wild man, but his sword cannot penetrate his fur-like hair, which looks like armor. Then he tries to strangle the wild man, which doesn't work either. Finally, he can defeat him by means of a spell provided to him by the dwarf. It turns out that the wild man can speak. He willingly gives Dietrich further tips to help him overcome his arch-enemy, the giant Siegenot. Wild children. Wolf children or wild children are children, often foundlings, who grew up isolated from humans for a while at a young age, and therefore differ in their learned behavior from children who grew up normally. In rare cases, wolf children were adopted by animals and lived with them. There are many stories and legends about wolf children, but scientists have only been able to study a few real cases. Since the middle of the 14th century, at least 53 wild children have been found. In the documented cases, the integration of these children into human society was not particularly successful. For example, Victor von Averon and Kaspar Hauser. Disregarding these historical experiences, fabulous heroes are often said to have a childhood outside of human civilization, as if that were a prerequisite for superhuman achievements. In Roman mythology, Romulus and Remus are suckled by a she-wolf, a very popular motif in European and Oriental mythology, as similar stories are reported by the Slovakian warriors Walagor and Wirwadub, by the founder of the Old Persian Empire, Kairos, and by the legendary hero Dietrich von Bern in Germanic mythology. Also, the biblical Moses was hidden for a while in the reed thicket before he was found and could enjoy a special education.